Hello and welcome to the Fully Charged Plus podcast. Now, we've been producing this podcast now for over 4 years, and although it isn't the main outlet we produce, it's become increasingly important because we've had some seriously impressive, knowledgeable and fascinating guests on the show in that time, and we've got a lot of very interesting guests booked up to appear on the show in the coming months. However, every now and then I pull rank. Well, in a very apologetic and classically embarrassed British way. I say, I'll do a whole podcast episode on my own. And the crew that work on these things, that produce all these amazing shows we do, they go quiet. I think there's a clue in that. They don't go, oh, whoopee, Robert, what a brilliant idea. That said, I'm being a little bit too self-deprecating because actually when I do episodes on my own, they do get quite a lot of more downloads. It doesn't go down in the downloads, it goes up a bit. That's all I'm saying. But that is not to denigrate our wonderful guests. God, you've got to be careful in this day and age of what you say, and I rarely am. This is one of those episodes that I'm going to do on my own. It's been inspired by a few experiences I've had over the last few months, but I want to start the jolly old ball rolling by referring to our wonderful sponsor, My Energy. Now, okay, I've waxed lyrical about the brilliant technology coming out of their amazing new factory that My Energy have built in Grimsby in the UK. And having them as sponsors of the Fully Charged Plus podcast is just a wonderful turn of events because I have known them since they started. And I have all the technology they produce. I have it installed in my house. So the two main products, really, that I've now come to understand, this is the critically important bit, is the Zappy and the Eddy. This is what they've focused on, this is what they've made work really well. Zappy is a truly brilliant device. It's super easy to use, super reliable. It's a home car charger. If you've not heard of the Zappy charger before, it meets all the modern regulatory requirements and then some. And if you've never used an electric car and you've never plugged one in, you don't know anything about charging electric cars at home, super quick explanation. What the critical thing with electric cars is to charge them when the demand is low. And this is very easy to manage 99% of the time. There'll be occasional days where you go, I really need to get the car charged and it's 5 o'clock in the evening, peak time. It happens to all of us. But generally speaking, you try and charge them out of peak time. And it's particularly if you've got a variable cost tariff. So if it's more expensive in the day and cheaper at night, then you charge your car at night. And so many electric cars have timers built into them. You can set when they start charging within the car, and you can set when they start and stop charging. So that means you get back home, you plug the car in, you don't do anything else. You don't have to think about it. You have to wait up to plug it in at the right time. You plug it in, nothing happens, it starts charging when the timer says so. But even if your car doesn't have this facility, and there's quite a lot of older cars don't have this, and those older cars are coming on the market now as second-hand cars, the Zappy charger you can set the time physically on the charger or remotely using the brilliant My Energy app. And now, I'm a right old fusspot when it comes to apps. They generally annoy me unless they're really simple to use and really easy to understand. And the My Energy app is both of those. And if you've got solar panels on your roof and a Zappy charger, then that's when it starts to really come into its own, because you can take any excess solar that comes off your roof and goes into the grid, power you're not using in your house, you can then, instead of sending it into the grid, you can put it all in your car. And the Zappy regulates the amount, so you're not using any electricity from the grid, you're just using your excess solar that would otherwise go into the grid. Now, this has been the most brilliant aspect of this charger, and I know there's other chargers now that will do this, but the Zappy were there first. I'm just going to put that there. I've had long experience of charging my cars from 100% solar and nothing else. I've driven close to 20,000 miles in the last 6 years on 100% home-generated solar. That is an incredible achievement. That is impossible to do with any other technology we know at the moment. Petrol, I haven't got a refinery here. Diesel, no refinery or an oil well. Hydrogen, well, yeah, I could use the solar to split water, store it in a tank, pressurize it in a tank, empty that tank into the tank in the car. I could do that. I would be losing about 4 kilowatt hours for every kilowatt hour that I would be usefully able to use in the car. And I'd have to install probably £200,000 to £300,000 worth of equipment in the car. So what I'm saying is this works, and it works now. But the Zappy can do this, much more than this, and the company are always improving their products, but that's only one half of the home energy setup that they produce. The other is the Eddy. And this little box fella lives in a cupboard at my house. He doesn't make a fuss, he doesn't require any attention or emotional support, and just manages all the power inputs and outputs seamlessly in the background. I do nothing. Background, not back room, because he's in a cupboard. But in the background, everything is looked after. If there's a lot of excess solar and I'm up charging the car, the Eddy will push that energy into the hot water system or the central heating battery, and I do nothing. That's why I like it. I don't have to do anything. And I know that later this year, My Energy are bringing out some new products, which is going to be very exciting. And they've told me about them just after they told me that they're not telling anyone about them. So I'm really looking forward to seeing what they're doing. A really exciting company. For more information, go to myenergy, myenergi.com and have a look. And now, on with the show. So one of the disadvantages of spending the last 12 years being immersed in the energy transition, electric ground transport, batteries, smart grids, renewable energy, sustainable technology, and all the myriad of connected topics and technologies, I sometimes become a little short-tempered with people who've just started to think about these topics in the last few weeks. I mean, this recent interest has certainly been launched by the ridiculous and unsustainable increase in the cost of toxic imported fossil fuel. But that's been on the cards for years. Since human beings first discovered oil seeping out of the ground, it has always been used as a weapon of war. All these oil assets have also always been fought over. If we could calculate the number of people who have suffered a violent death simply to secure the supply of oil for their particular country, I think we'd all be even more depressed than we are already. The simple fact of the matter is burning fossil fuel is an unsustainable short-term business. But that aside, I'm not defending my occasional short temper when it comes to discussing the energy transition. I think it's a really negative failing on my part, and I must try and contain the frustration or find a harmless way of diffusing it. And of course, this is very much a social media issue, as I was recently reminded. I mean, you all know about this stuff. It's nothing special. A few weeks ago, however, I was sitting in a sunny garden just down the lane from where I live with one of our lovely neighbours. She's in her late 70s, perfectly charming, although I've only met her a couple of times over the years. Another person at the small gathering mentioned that they had been thinking of getting an electric car and wanted to ask me about it. Now, before I could say anything, the charming lady chipped in. Not rudely, but she just chipped in. And she said, well, it's all well and good with these electric cars, but has anybody thought about where all the electricity is going to come from? So I took a minute to reflect on my reaction. Had I read a comment like this on social media or, comments on YouTube, whatever, it might have elicited I'll be honest, a curt response from me. Something along the lines of, ooh, let me think. Has anyone who runs the national grid in the UK or any electricity grid on the planet ever considered how to manage the changes in energy demand and grid management created by the introduction of electric ground transport? Oh, what a massive surprise. Yes, they have. So that's a snippy, know-all comment from a spiking and unpleasant person. Sitting in a sunny garden with an actual human being is a very different experience. So I calmly and politely explained that indeed people have been thinking about this topic for the last 15 to 20 years. I expanded further that when I said people, I was talking about the engineers who run the national grid and the extended electricity generating and distribution system. People who have repeatedly said in public, on radio and television, many times, repeatedly said electric vehicles will improve the grid stability and the country will require less electricity generation, not more. I explained the theory of how millions of electric vehicles in the future, with bidirectional charging as standard, which is the way things are going at the moment, would be a positive benefit to the energy grid and help reduce the expensive and dirty generation spikes we have to deal with now. Well, she nodded and smiled. She thanked me for explaining it. She wasn't being cynical. She was being very nice. But I could sense maybe she didn't need quite such a detailed response when she moved off to talk to someone less dull. Fine. It was fine. That happens. But over the past 12 years, I've become fascinated by how people respond to a new technology. And it always seems to start with fear and suspicion, very understandably. Then partly informed criticism, absolutely understandable, and eventually acceptance and a knowing nod to the past when things were, as we could then see, much, much worse. I mean, mobile phones are the obvious example in our fairly recent history. The first big brick phones, I don't know if young people won't even remember those. If you look up mobile phone 1980s, you'll just be staggered at how big they were. The first big brick phones were just massive jokes, and the people who used them were considered by everyone on the planet to be massive tossers. I mean, they were so tragic. 10 minutes talk time you had. That's what it was called. Now, the new Nokia 18500, whatever the hell, awful numbers they had. Now with 10 minutes talk time. I mean, they really were tragic. But look at them now. Try living without a smartphone now. It's really difficult. So we have reached a stage with regards to electric vehicles and home energy systems where the vast majority of the technological challenges have been overcome for quite some time. The final hurdles are psychological, not technical. Still, the initial response, which has been very cleverly nurtured by the incumbent industries, what I'm talking about there is the oil industry and the automotive industry, the people who are most at risk from major change, it's generally negative. With a little bit of encouragement from the merchants of doubt, people can remain sceptical for many years, as change is uncomfortable, and human beings, we don't like to be uncomfortable. I know, I like to be comfortable. I'm sure you do too. And the kindly elderly lady I met in the sunny garden is a good example of this. She has a little hatchback car. She's had it for years. I see her regularly when I'm out for my walk. She drives past, she waves, it's all very lovely. It's easy to use that car, she's used to it. She doesn't need to change the habits of a lifetime. It's not a massive brand new 3-ton SUV. She's not doing any serious harm with this little car, so why bother to change? And she will be reassured by the torrents of negative sniping about the pitfalls of electric vehicles from the olden days media. And by that I'm referring to the newspapers, which I'm confident this nice old lady would still read. But that's the soft tip of the anti-electric vehicle and renewable energy missile. Incoming! I mean, 12 years ago, I would never have predicted two things. Battery-powered electric aircraft, never could not see that coming. And the other thing I couldn't see coming was a fanatical political opposition to anything other than burning fossil fuel. Shock jock radio shows and fanatical extremist sites now regularly pontificate about energy, where it comes from, how we generate it, and what impact it has. Suddenly, odd men, usually men who don't like women, gays, people with darker skin, odd men who love guns and flags, seem to know many facts about the massive negative impact electric cars will have on the planet. I don't know where they get these from. Well, I don't want to read where they get these from. I do know where they get these from. I would put good money on the table to bet they have never, not once in their lives, considered the massive negative aspects of drilling for, extracting, pumping, storing and shipping fossil fuel in oil tankers, the highest emitting machines that we have ever built. I just want a little aside note about that. When you build a big ship, say a cruise liner, there's a certain amount of the hull that is under the water. I don't know what the percentage is. It's quite low because it's a big floaty thing and it's full of people. We're not that heavy when it comes to shipping. Container ships, they float a little bit low because they've got many thousands of tons of stuff in all the containers. And they are vast, vast vessels. Oil tankers, no question about this. It's not a theory, it's fact. Oil tankers float the lowest in the sea. The most of their hull is underwater when they're carrying oil. Oil is very heavy. I know it floats on water, but you put millions of tons of oil in tanks on an oil tanker, it floats low. And it's pushing vast amounts of water out of the way. Huge amounts of friction it has to overcome. Massive engines with huge propellers at the back that are burning millions of tons of the filthiest emitting fuel ever. Bunker fuel. So to move oil around the oceans, which we do all the time, every day, billions of tons of it, is the dirtiest way of moving the dirtiest fuel that we burn in the dirtiest engines. Sorry, that's a little aside. And that's only a fraction of the story. Then we have to pump it from a ship in a dock up into a big holding tank. How do we pump it? How is it pumped? Is it donkeys walking around in circles? No, it isn't. We use electric pumps. And when I say electric pumps, these pumps are the size of a small terraced house. They are massive and use jaw-dropping amounts of electricity. I spent 2 days in a large oil refinery filming an old school TV series long before I started the Fully Charged show 12 years ago. And I stood next to one of these massive pumps to record a piece to camera. I said something like, "These massive pumps can shift billions of barrels of thick, sticky oil through these very, very long pipes that come all the way from that ship right down there in the dock." In many ways, this was a key experience that pushed me to start making the series. The sheer scale of the industrial impact of using oil was really brought home to me. This was reinforced when I met and interviewed an amazing man called Diarmuid O'Connell. He was at the time vice president of Tesla Motors back in 2010. That's when I met him. I'll put links to these things in the show notes because that episode is still available. You can watch it. Diarmuid had worked for the US government before Tesla. He'd actually worked for the Bush administration before he worked at Tesla. He now works at Volvo. He's moved on from Tesla, but he did work there for many years. An amazing man. And he had toured the globe for the Bush administration, was it old Bush or new Bush? I can't remember which Bush it was. It was one of the Bushes. But Republicans, proper, old school, conservative American politicians. He toured all over the globe trying to secure energy resources for the United States. That was his job. His job was to understand where the oil and gas was coming from, who was moving it, who owned it, where it was being shipped to, how it was coming out, all that stuff. And after a few years, he was so appalled by the genuine cost and impact of burning oil that he joined the very early stage Tesla Motors company and was a critical part of the initial push to prove that we could use ground transport without burning oil. So in the very first episode of the Fully Charged show, I spent a big chunk of the episode trying to, in a very crude way, to explain the real impact of the oil industry before we fill the tank and burn the damn stuff in a clanking old inefficient combustion engine. Every year, billions of tons of thick, sticky crude oil gets pumped into huge multi-million gallon storage tanks. They are massive. When you climb up them and walk on the roof, the scale of it is huge. Well, then we start to use proper huge amounts of electricity to refine that oil. You have to heat oil to incredibly high temperatures. So to do that, you burn oil, but you also use a lot of electricity. And you've got to remember that this is the oil that we've imported from some of the most brutal, unequal, despotic and medieval regimes on the planet, for pity's sake. And we're giving them money every day. Oh, yeah. Refining oil, easy peasy. Refining oil is easy peasy lemon squeeze. You've been doing it for years, as long as you've got a staggering amount of electricity on hand. Oil refineries use multiple terawatt hours a year. One refinery will use as much electricity in a year as a mid-sized city. Am I making that up? No. That's what the head engineer at the refinery I was filming at told me, very proudly. There's loads more pumping after we've actually refined it, and it's all separated off into different tanks. And we store it before pumping it into a diesel truck and driving it to a petrol gas station, where we then pump it using electricity all the time, pump it into a vehicle and eventually burn it in a combustion engine that is at best 28% efficient. Most of them much less than that. That's a really good, modern, well-maintained, efficient engine, 28%. That means 72% of the money we give to hostile foreign regimes and to the government as tax to fuel our cars is wasted. And they love us for it. And why do we accept this? Because that is normal. And any alternative to that is new and therefore must be treated with the maximum suspicion. So these myths, lies, and torrents of false allegations are propagated by surprisingly a small handful of fossil fuel lobbyists who aim their structured trolling at the mass of people who have zero experience and no counter-arguments. As I've said many times, most people don't think about energy and transport or the impacts. They don't care about it one way or another. And why should they? They just live normal lives, normally. I envy them. The only time the fossil fuel industry comes into focus is during a crisis, which we're having at the moment. I mean, very recently, it's the awkward realization that Russia is ruled by an angry little bully boy with a lot of insecurities, who supplies the West with vast amounts of oil and gas, and then steals all the money accruing from those sales. It is interesting, isn't it? Because the Russian people don't get benefit from the overseas oil sales. not entirely unlike when we had North Sea oil and gas in this country. The money just sort of went offshore somewhere. And I think that's what's been happening in Russia as well, because we know there's a lot of big houses in London that are owned by Russians. And where we held Fully Charged live at Farnborough Airfield, there's a whole area down one end of the airfield with a load of impounded Russian private jets. They've all been impounded by the British government. And, where does all that money come from? Just think about it. Is it from selling pharmaceuticals? No, it isn't. Russia doesn't do that. They sell us oil and gas. They're a petrostate. Anyway, suddenly people are thinking about where our energy comes from. And we are particularly thinking about how we keep warm in our often badly built, poorly insulated houses. Now, I'm not saying that from the point of view of it's our fault. We've inherited this huge legacy of really shoddily built and not even insulated homes. And it's going to be a massive job to bring them up to just even the lowest level of reasonableness. That description of domestic dwellings is specific to the UK, I should say that, where our old housing stock is a disgrace. And our new housing stock should be brilliant, and sadly often isn't. Of course, there have been technologies developed over the last 20 to 30 years that address most of these challenges. But as with electric cars, anyone scanning the traditional media might think that things like solar panels, small-scale domestic batteries, heat pumps and thermal storage systems were all developed in the last 1 or 2 weeks. All these technologies have been around for decades. There are, for example, 1.9 million heat pumps installed in all types of houses and apartments in Sweden, and nearly 750,000 heat pumps have been installed in Germany. And yet there are perfectly well-educated people in the UK who say things like, well, these fancy new heat pumps just don't work. The technology's just not ready yet. You're better off with gas. Because they read something in a scummy rag, a reputable newspaper that told them exactly this. Basically, a cut and paste story from a fossil fuel lobby group who are trying to keep the gas boiler industry going. And people who have no experience of heat pumps believe these well-paid fossil shill scumbags. Of course, over the last few months, when the price of toxic imported gas went stratospheric, these rubbish lies of gas being a good idea have collapsed into a heap of fetid waste product. But people will believe heat pumps aren't right for them for another decade at least. The aforementioned fossil lobbyists are working overtime, bribing the building industry bosses and spreading lies to delay the uptake of non-gas-based heating systems. So I recently had a very personal example of this battle when I finally disconnected the LPG, liquid petroleum gas tank, from my house. I no longer have anything in the house that can burn gas. And actually, for the last 10 years, I've only had gas central heating boiler that uses gas. Everything else has been electric. And that was the hardest thing to get rid of. I'm not saying that 10 years ago it was easy. 10 years ago it was hard. Now it's getting easier. So I didn't need the gas tank or the gas anymore. To cut a long, boring and very bitter battle very short, the company involved, Flowgas, did everything they could to stop me disconnecting. And when they failed at that, they then tried to charge me over £1,250 for the privilege of not buying any more of their gas. Quite a lot of long phone calls, emails, threatening lawyers' letters from them, and endless demands later, they finally backed down. I don't pay anything. They took away the gas tank, they took away the gas. Not because they decided to act sensibly and decently and fairly, but because they worked out that I did have a modest but noticeable Twitter following. As always, the fossil shifters are going to fight low and dirty, doing anything and everything they can to maintain their position of flogging toxic fuel in a monopolistic economy. You haven't got any choice. You've got to buy this filthy stuff, so buy it from me. So in both cases, I know electric cars work and are more than adequate for all our transportation needs, and non-gas burning houses work because the technology has moved on. Now, we are going to make an episode of the Fully Charged show soon, which will explain what I've done in this house. A warts and all tour of my 100% electric home. But to give you a quick teaser, We have just, and I've just checked today to make sure this is accurate, we have just completed 22 days of general electricity use, charging cars, heating the house, running electric cookers, water heating, and all the peripherals and lights and everything. What I'm doing here now is all powered by solar and batteries, and we have not used one electron from the national grid in 22 days. We've put quite a few electrons into the national grid, but none have come the other way. Now, yes, I'm a nutter and an extreme case now, although I predict that will change. Yes, this isn't the case in the winter. Yes, I could have spent all the money I've spent fitting out this house, I could have spent it on a cruise or a diesel SUV. I'm an old man past retirement age with no dependents, no mortgage on my house, and I'm still working full time. I'm not sure how long it might take to get payback on the equipment I've paid for, and I admit I'm lucky enough not to really care about it. I've done it because I want to know for sure that it's possible. So when I say we should stop burning gas, I don't then go home to a house that burns gas. But here's a good tweet I saw the other day which kind of sums up the mindset of people from my class, race and age background. Just listen to this. Us, well, we've just bought this new garden house. Them, oh, that looks gorgeous. Us, we've also just bought this latest diesel SUV. Them, oh, lovely. I bet it's very comfy. Us, we've just had our house fully insulated and got it up to passive house standards. Them, what's the payback on that? Blech. As soon as you see it, you understand the absurdity of the question. What, pray, is the payback on a summer house or a diesel SUV? I'll tell you, it's never. It's a luxury purchase and no one questions the economic viability of such ludicrous fashion choices. But insulate your home in the UK, that's almost the most offensive thing you can do to some very peculiar and angry people. I don't know why. As I've already said, people who've never thought about where the materials that make everything we use comes from, suddenly, when there's a new technology, start asking really important questions. No, legitimately important questions. Where do the materials come from for these fancy batteries? Now, if you are, say, under 25, you've lived with batteries all your life. They're just normal. But if you're over 40, maybe over 50, batteries are weird new things. They were rubbish when we were kids. They were terrible, and you always threw them away. So that's the logic. You buy a battery, you use it, it runs out, you throw it away. That's how we've all grown up. Young people don't have this problem. This is definitely an old git problem. But where do the materials for these fancy batteries come from? Never where does the fuel that we burn in our fancy engines, in our fancy cars comes from, in our diesel SUVs. No, never ask that. Never. That's my job. That's what I've been repeating for the last 12 years. Ask those questions. Where does your fuel come from? But these questions about battery materials, they cannot be dismissed. If we're going to make this transition worthwhile, we have to behave more responsibly than the fossil fuel industry has done for the last 120 years. Now, this is where it gets funny. Because admittedly, to behave more responsibly than the fossil fuel industry, that is a very, very low bar. So we really have to raise our game and raise that bar as high as we possibly can. We all need to know where the materials come from and who is suffering as a result of their extraction and processing. We need to know how long we can use the products made from these materials, and we need to know what happens to them at the end of their useful lives. Well, guess what? Over the last 12 years, the answers to pretty much all those requirements have emerged. The materials needed for batteries are changing. We will need less and less rare and expensive or ethically challenging materials and use more common, cheap and abundant materials. We now know this product, the battery, will last way longer than the fossil shifters claimed 10 or 12 years ago. We are looking at a total useful life for a battery of well over 30 years. 30 years. And recently, as I have mentioned previously, Tesla are talking about the 100-year battery. At the end of life, well over 95% of that battery, the packaging, everything, can be recycled and used to make new batteries. We have to do this. It's an absolutely essential part of the entire transition. It has to be this way for all technology and manufactured goods in future. We have no choice. It's not a political stance. It's just how things have to be. We cannot chuck stuff away when we've finished using it. We have to be able to use those materials again. If there's one thing I've learned in the last 12 years, it's not about fashion or virtue signaling. It's not even about climate change or local air quality. Fundamentally, it's about sustainability. If we can get that right, if we can reach a point where everyone alive, regardless of where they live, regardless of their wealth, can live in a technologically relatively advanced world that keeps us comfortable, fed, warm in winter, cool in summer, without trashing the planet we live on, then we will have achieved something the human race has resolutely failed to do so far in our long history. We have to be incredibly energy efficient. We might have to change one or two well-entrenched habits. I mean, here's an example. Now, we're all quite happy to share the use of buses, planes, ships, trains, pavements/sidewalks, bridges, I don't know, roads. We share those. No problem with that. We're all used to sharing and it's normal. Well, it's looking fairly obvious to many people, and myself included, that we might also need to share cars. So that means we don't own cars, we used shared cars. Because you don't own a bus when you get on the bus, you don't own the train when you get on the train, and you don't own the train and let other people get on it. It's just a train, it's owned by a big company, sometimes really well run, sometimes less so. Now this is going to be a generational change, but for some people, okay, some men, oh Lord, do not even suggest to some men that we share cars. And I'm going to say something that will annoy some people. Definitely don't suggest it to men who like playing golf. I've just seen this correlation. I sometimes get asked, I think it's an age thing where the people see me and they think, oh, he's old, he must play golf. They're not angry, they're baffled. They're befuddled when I say I don't play. They say, Robert, do you play golf? And I went, no, why would I play golf? But I try and be polite. And they go, you don't play golf? I go, no. But seriously, you don't play. They go on and on about it. Oh my God. Those men always get angry about electric cars. They get angry about, well, they're just angry. They're perma-furious. And they get angry about, all the usual things. I don't need to list them. But they're always the most skeptical about electric cars. And I always say to them, don't buy an electric car. Don't go anywhere near them. Let everybody else get them. Carry on paying a lot of money for your petrol and diesel. Anyway, but it's going to be an unpopular idea with some members of my generation, and very unpopular, I would suggest, amongst many Americans. Not all, but many. But I still predict that it will be extremely common in many European and Asian cities in the coming 10 years. We have to question not only the energy system that moves a car along the road, but also the ownership model. We've all been brought up in a world where private car ownership is considered normal. But it's important to point out that we are the minority of the world's population, where that is, we're in the minority where it's economically possible to have a privately owned vehicle. The majority of the global population have never owned a car, and quite a few have never even been in one. This is another thing I've learned in the last 12 years. Electric cars are seen by some as expensive virtue signalling playthings, and normal people can't afford them. Hang on a minute, where do these normal people live, and how do you calculate who is normal? A lot of people in Europe, in North America, in Australia, they would have to do with second, third, fourth, or even fifth-hand gasoline, petrol, or diesel cars. I mean, I did. I didn't buy a new car, and it was the biggest mistake I've ever made. I didn't buy a new car until I was in my mid-50s. I was, I think, 53 years old when I bought a new car. Up to then, every car I'd had been second-hand, third-hand, fourth-hand. But if you can afford to buy, say, a fifth-hand, battered old car, petrol I'm talking, you've got to tax it, you've got to insure it, you've got to maintain it, you've got to buy fuel for it, and you drive it, you are still in a privileged minority when viewed from a global perspective. So the sensible solution to this, if we're still going to use cars, is to share them. Just look at it this way. You've spent between £5,000 and £10,000 buying, say, a third-hand electric car, in good nick. Only two owners. You pay to tax it, to insure it. You pay for fuel and endless expensive maintenance to keep the damn thing going. Now, boy, do I remember that. How much I used to spend keeping old petrol cars on the road. A lot of money. And then you only use it for 5 or 10% of the time you own it. For the vast majority of the time you own that car, it's just parked around somewhere, doing nothing. We're all used to it. It's normal. We all live with parked cars littering every available square foot around us. Our urban streets are jammed bumper to bumper with unused cars. When you look at it like that, it's just a daft way of doing things. In the end, regardless of what makes these cars move along the road, it's an unsustainable system. Just as we've grown up in a world where burning billions of gallons of toxic fossil fuel is normal, that doesn't mean it's a good idea or that we have no choice. Certainly in the past we haven't had much choice, but we now have a choice. Nothing, of course, is straightforward. Nothing is a simple solution. Everything we do has consequences, and that's what the debate around these topics is all about. Now, I realise that I've been making these same arguments for 12 years. You sort of think they would change, but essentially they're the same ones. Some of them have changed a bit, but it's remarkable how many people have literally not moved an inch from the pontifications of some tall motoring commentators in 2008. And just the other day, perfect example, Fiona Howarth, the electric car expert at Octopus Energy in the UK, amazing energy company. We've done a lot of stuff with them in the past, and Fiona has been on the Fully Charged Plus podcast a few times. She's an extraordinary, she just has brilliant insights into the energy matrix and electric vehicles. She had an article published in a British, let's say, ultra-conservative tabloid newspaper called the Daily Mail. And this is a bit like an environmental and social activist in the USA being invited to deliver an unedited opinion piece on primetime Fox News. Fiona was explaining in a non-dramatic, sensible, low-key way that hybrids are really no longer relevant and pure electric cars are the best solution at present. All well and good. For a moment, I felt, well, we've moved on. Even a reactionary news outlet like the Daily Mail is now open to the argument that we need to stop endlessly burning imported fossil fuel in filthy old cars. Until I stupidly read the comments. Because you sort of think, oh, I bet the comments are really reactionary. No, they won't be. Come on, be reasonable. People are more intelligent than that. Scroll down, and I was reminded that the exact same lies that Jeremy Clarkson spouted back in 2008, the same garbage freaks like Nigel Lawson from his vile little fossil fuel lobbying group, the same rubbish he spouts about the climate, bizarre nut jobs like Bjorn Lomborg and all their scrotty little sidekicks that are repeated endlessly by a large herd of blinkered, angry, perma-furious commentators on the vile pages of this dreadful old rag. It was so tragic. Don't look. You won't learn anything. You know it all already. They talk about it takes 10 hours to charge a car when you're on the motorway. I mean, they're doing it. I mean, they're not trolling. Someone could say that to me because they see me on the telly or something, or they hear me on the radio, and then they'll say that to me to try and get a bit of a reaction. No, this is people talking to each other in the hate-filled bubble of the Daily Mail. They talk about batteries catching fire every day, or that we have to throw batteries away after 6 months. All these things were there. There was a claim that we've already run out of lithium. My God, lithium is one of the most common elements on the planet. We'll never run out of lithium. We're going to run out of iron before we run out of lithium. Just the staggering, proudly held, flag-waving ignorance was really jaw-dropping. 12 years later, and nothing has changed for these slightly ill-informed people. They heard some lie from some reactionary bully in 2008, and that's it. Stasis. Don't consider anything could change. Sadly for this great mass of people who've never... when you think about it, it's just ridiculous. This mass of people, they have never watched the Fully Charged Show. They would have never heard of the Fully Charged Show, and they would hate every last sentence anyone has ever uttered on the Fully Charged Show. All of the 150 million views the series has earned in the last 12 years barely make a dent in the side of the massive global oil industry tanker that is extracting and refining more and more toxic, expensive, corrupting and poisonous, irreplaceable, unsustainable fuel than it ever has in its dirty, bitter history. So yes, 12 years in, it would be very easy to be despondent. But I have to remember there have been subtle changes in public attitudes to the technologies like electric ground transport and renewables. It's not a small shift, it's actually quite a big shift. Things are changing. There are plenty of huge problems ahead. But there's one thing I've learned in that 12 years, and to be honest, I learned it for many years before that, just from the privilege of interacting with a particular group of people. You see, I'll see a problem facing the mass adoption of a technology that doesn't require burning stuff in order to work, and a problem that seems insurmountable, and I'll get really despondent. It's just like, what's the point? This is impossible. An engineer sees a problem that seems insurmountable, and they get excited and creative. They love an insurmountable problem. That's what we're really seeing during this early part of the energy transition. Enormous ingenuity and creativity in so many areas. It's genuinely inspiring and encouraging. So politely ignore the naysayers and their well-funded supporters, and the grotty lobby groups and the corrupt politicians that keep pushing and pushing and pushing for us to maintain our dependence on toxic, expensive, imported, filthy, I didn't say any rude words, fossil fuel. Things are changing. Things can and need to get more efficient, more sustainable, less damaging to our environments, and I truly believe they are. We don't need to do anything to save the planet. The planet is fine. The planet does not give a toss what we do. The planet will still be here long, long after we've all shuffled off. We need to save ourselves. That's what we need to do. We need to make the technology we live with sustainable, longer lasting, and less impactful on ourselves as well as the world that we live in. That's it. I've finished. I'll shut up now. I hope you didn't hate listening to that. That's as good as I can hope for. We'll be back next week with proper guests and really interesting conversations. So please do subscribe to the Fully Charged Plus podcast. Subscriptions are growing a lot. People are downloading it a lot. It's wonderful. We're really pleased. Quick thanks again to My Energy for sponsoring this episode. Have a look at the Patreon link. All the links. Not there's going to be a lot this time, but the links to that I may have mentioned in this episode will be in the show notes. And that's it. As always, if you have been, thank you for listening.